Some people come into this world already carrying a weight that has no name, not in their bones, not in their blood, but in the quiet place behind the eyes where a person learns, too early and too completely, that showing up is the most they are allowed to expect. Racheal Williams understood that the way only people who were never given the alternative can understand it. By 26, she had watched her mother leave twice, once through the front door when Racheal was 9, and once through her own choices, slowly and without apology, every year after that. She had sat in a financial aid office at 21 and listened to a counselor explain, in the careful voice people use when they are delivering a verdict they don't want to own, that the numbers no longer worked. That the nursing degree she had spent 2 years building herself toward would have to wait. That wait had become a permanent address she never planned to live at. So she waitressed. Double shifts at the Hanok, an upscale Korean fusion restaurant in Atlanta whose gleaming surfaces and soft lighting were designed to make certain people feel they had arrived somewhere. Racheal moved through it in a bright red uniform, refilling water glasses, memorizing orders without writing them down, smiling with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that the tip depends on the performance. She was good at the job. She was good at most things she applied herself to. That had never been the problem. But here is what no one tells you about a woman who has spent years absorbing loss without flinching. She stops calculating. Not because she is careless, but because calculation requires a belief that the outcome can still go in your favor. And Racheal Williams, by the evening of that ordinary Tuesday, had lived long enough at ground level that the distance between her life and a worse one no longer felt like much of a gap to protect. That night, a small elderly Korean woman sat alone at table 7, silver hair, pale hands folded neatly on the tablecloth, the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to dining without company. She ordered carefully and ate slowly and left a generous tip on her first glass of water, which Racheal noticed because people who leave early tips are always the ones who were raised to see the person holding the pitcher. She didn't know she was sitting in the path of something that had been arranged before she arrived. She was just a grandmother eating alone. And Racheal, for reasons she could not have explained and did not stop to find, looked at her and felt something move in her chest that had been still for a long time. When the shock came, Racheal didn't think. She didn't calculate the distance, or the risk, or the cost. She moved her body in front of another body the way you move before your mind has been consulted, and the bullet that was never meant for her found her left shoulder instead. She went down onto the restaurant floor in her red uniform, her arms still wrapped around the woman she had just shielded, her wide dark eyes open and filling with the shock of pain she hadn't felt yet because the adrenaline was still louder than everything else. She did not know, could not have known, had no reason in the world to have guessed, that the silver-haired woman trembling against her chest was Yoon Young-sun. That the name Yoon, in Atlanta's underground, was not a name spoken carelessly. That Young-sun's son, the man whose phone was already vibrating with a message that contained exactly 4 words and required nothing more, was the kind of man entire rooms rearranged themselves around before he entered them. Fate doesn't file a request. It doesn't wait for a convenient moment. It walks into an ordinary restaurant on an ordinary Tuesday, finds the one woman in the room who has run out of reasons to protect herself, and changes the entire geometry of her life between one breath and the next. This is the story of Racheal Williams. The woman in the red uniform. The woman with nothing she was afraid to lose. And because of that, the only one who could change everything. If this story is already reaching something in you, please tap like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Every story we tell is a life. And this one is just beginning. Yoon Tae-sung's phone lit up at 9:47 in the evening. His head of security sent 3 words. Hanok. Yama. Now. Nothing else was needed. Tae-sung was already moving before the screen went dark. He didn't run. A man like Tae-sung doesn't run. Because running means something has gotten ahead of him, and nothing in 15 years had been allowed to get ahead of him. But the 2 staff members standing in the hallway of the private floor would remember, for the rest of their time in his employ, the way he passed them, not fast, not loud, but with the particular density of a man for whom the air in a room has no choice but to move out of the path first. The black car was pulling out of the private garage in under 90 seconds. Atlanta at night slid past the windows like a city that didn't know it was being watched, and Taesung didn't see any of it. He sat with his jaw set and his right hand flat on his knee, open, not clenched, and the two men in the car with him understood that this was the version of him that required absolute silence. Not the version that raised his voice. The version that didn't need to. The Hanok came into view. Blue and red lights fractured across the wet pavement outside. The door of the car opened before the driver completed the stop. Taesung's driver had been midway through a turn when the call came through. The car straightened without discussion, the route already recalculating. By the time they arrived at the Hanok restaurant, the ambulance was still there, its lights painting the traditional wooden facade in rotations of red and white that felt obscene against the elegance of the architecture. He stepped out into air that smelled of expensive food and fear. The kind of scent that settles over a place when violence has just brushed past it, close enough to leave everyone's hands shaking. Inside, the dining room had been transformed into something else entirely. What had been Seoul's most exclusive private venue an hour ago was now a crime scene wearing the mask of an accident. Staff clustered near the kitchen entrance. Guests who should have been escorted out immediately still lingered in corners, their shock valuable enough that someone had allowed them to stay. Blood traced a path across the floor in a pattern Taesung's eyes followed automatically, reconstructing trajectory and force and the exact moment when physics had overcome intention. His mother sat in the center of it all like a queen on a stage she hadn't chosen, a cashmere shawl wrapped around shoulders that refused to tremble. She was 73 and had survived 3 different iterations of Korean power. She knew better than to look fragile in front of strangers. Yama. He reached her in 4 strides, his hand on her arm, his voice pitched low enough that it belonged only to her. Are you hurt? No. The word came out clipped, certain. Then her composure cracked just enough for him to see the woman underneath. Taesung, the girl I know. He didn't, but he would. He squeezed her arm once, a gesture that served as both comfort and dismissal, then straightened. Minjun appeared at his elbow as if summoned by thought alone. His lieutenant had the kind of face that arranged itself into whatever expression the moment required. Right now, concern shaded with appropriate anger, nothing excessive. He'd been with Taesung long enough to know that excess was the same as weakness. Status, Taesung said. Guess struck your mother, the waitress intervened. Took the blow herself. Shoulder injury, possibly collarbone. Paramedics are loading her now. Taesung's gaze moved to the stretcher being maneuvered through the doorway with the careful urgency of people who knew they were being watched. He could see the woman's profile, young, dark skin against white sheets, the red of her uniform now decorated with a deeper red that had soaked through the fabric at her shoulder. Her eyes were closed. Whether from pain or shock or something else entirely, he couldn't tell from this distance. Which hospital? He asked. Seoul Central, Minjun said. Standard emergency protocol. No. The word came out flat, final. Taesung pulled his phone from his pocket, fingers already moving. Divert to Shinseki Medical. Private intake, no record. I want Dr. Yoon on call and ready when she arrives. Minjun's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Are you sure? Shinseki is private, Taesung finished. Expensive. Discreet. And mine. He sent the message, then looked up. Make it happen. Yes, Sejangam. Taesung watched his lieutenant move toward the paramedics, already speaking into his phone, his voice carrying the particular tone that made things happen without question. The stretcher paused. There would be a discussion, brief and professional, and then the destination would change because money and power made even emergency protocols negotiable. He turned back to the room, his gaze cataloging details the way he'd been trained to since he was old enough to understand that information was currency. The overturned chair. The broken porcelain scattered across the floor in a pattern that suggested violence rather than accident. The guests who weren't looking at his mother anymore but at their phones, already composing the messages that would turn tonight into tomorrow's whispered scandal. The guest who struck her, Taesung said. Where is he? Manager's office. Security is keeping him there until the police arrive. Send them away. Minjun paused. The police? Everyone. Police can take statements tomorrow. Pay whoever needs paying, sign whatever needs signing. I want this room empty in 10 minutes. Understood. Taesung moved toward the window, watching the ambulance pull away with a woman he didn't know inside it. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. 34 years old, suit worth more than most people earned in a month, face arranged in the careful neutrality that served him better than emotion ever had. Why did she do it? The question had arrived fully formed the moment Minjun described what happened, and it hadn't left. Not because he was grateful. Gratitude was something he'd learned to simulate rather than feel. Not because he was concerned, though he'd already made the decision to ensure she received the best care available. He couldn't leave it alone because it didn't make sense. People didn't throw themselves in front of danger for strangers. Not in his world. Not in any world he'd ever inhabited. They calculated risk and reward, measured cost against benefit, and made decisions that served their own survival. That was the fundamental law of existence, confirmed by every interaction he'd ever witnessed or orchestrated. But she had moved. According to Minjun's account, according to the blood pattern on the floor, according to the simple physics of it, she had moved between his mother and harm without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the self-preservation that should have stopped her. Why? Behind him, Minjun was already clearing the room with the efficient brutality of someone who knew exactly which words opened which doors. Taesung heard voices rising and falling, the particular cadence of negotiation that sounded like suggestion but functioned as command. His phone buzzed. Dr. Yoon confirming receipt, staff mobilizing, private wing being prepared. Taesung typed a response, then looked back at the street where the ambulance had disappeared into Seoul's midnight traffic. He would find out why. Not because he needed to understand her. People were puzzles he'd stopped trying to solve years ago. But because actions that defied logic were dangerous, and dangerous things needed to be contained, controlled, or eliminated. And first, you had to understand them. He turned from the window. His mother was being helped to her feet by staff who touched her like she was made of porcelain. She would go home, take something for her nerves that she'd never admit to needing, and tomorrow she would thank him for handling things the way he always did, quietly, completely, without leaving loose threads. Minjun, he said. Sir? I want everything on her. Name, background, why she was working here, where she lives. Everything. By morning. His lieutenant nodded once, already reaching for his phone. Taesung buttoned his suit jacket and moved toward his mother, his mind already 3 moves ahead, planning for variables he couldn't yet see. The woman with dark skin and red uniform had done something inexplicable, and Taesung had learned long ago that inexplicable things were just patterns he hadn't recognized yet. Racheal came back to consciousness the way you surface from deep water, slowly, and with the distinct sense that the world above had rearranged itself while you were under. The first thing she noticed was the ceiling. It was high and white and unblemished, the kind of ceiling that exists in spaces where someone has decided that even the parts people don't look at directly should be without flaw. She stared at it for a long moment, running her mind back through the last thing she remembered, the sound that didn't belong, the woman at table 7, the movement her body made before her brain had finished forming the thought. And then the ceiling stopped being interesting and the pain in her left shoulder introduced itself with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting patiently for her to wake up. She didn't make a sound. She took a breath, absorbed the information, and began to look around. The room was large. Not hotel large, not hospital large. The kind of large that belongs to private spaces built for people who consider square footage a baseline rather than a luxury. White walls with the particular warmth of expensive paint. Pale wood furniture, clean-lined and without ornament, the kind of pieces that announce their cost through what they leave out rather than what they put in. A window on the far wall opened onto a courtyard garden, stone pathways, dark green plantings, a small water feature catching the pale morning light in a way that looked less like a garden and more like someone's considered idea of what peace should look like when rendered in physical space. Racheal had seen photographs of rooms like this. In magazines left behind at the hammock by guests who carried them in from elsewhere and forgot them on their way out. She looked down at herself. The red uniform was gone. She was wearing a patient's robe in a soft cream fabric that cost more than it had any obligation to, given its function. Her left shoulder was dressed with the neat, unhurried precision of someone who had done this work with excellent tools and enough time to do it correctly. No county ER had done this. County ERs were competent, and exhausted, and working on 4 people at once. Whoever had dressed this wound had worked like they had only her. She sat up slowly, bracing with her right hand, and ran the rest of her inventory before she let herself think about anything else. It was a habit she had developed somewhere between the 3rd and 4th year of showing up to jobs where she was the only person in the room who looked like her, the quiet, practiced act of knowing exactly where she was before deciding how to be there. 2 doors, one almost certainly a bathroom, one leading out. The window was a floor up at minimum, possibly 2. The sound of the house around her was the sound of a place with many people moving through it carefully, not the silence of emptiness but the silence of discipline, the particular hush of staff trained to exist without being noticed. She was not a guest. The robe was too good and the door handle was the wrong kind for a guest room, the kind that locked from the outside as readily as the inside. She was not a prisoner either, or not exactly, because prisoners are categorized and Racheal had the distinct, unsettling sense that she had not been categorized yet. She was something in between. A variable that had arrived in an unexpected way and hadn't been assigned a column. She was still working out what that meant when the door opened. He didn't knock. The door simply opened, and Yoon Tae-sung walked into the room the way she imagined he walked into every room, not like he owned it, because men who own things still carry some awareness of the ownership. More like the room's ownership was a question that had already been settled long before he arrived and didn't require his attention. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than the black suit suggested at first, jet black hair slicked back with the clean severity of someone for whom appearance was not vanity but precision. The collar of the white shirt beneath the jacket was opened by 2 buttons. She could see the edge of ink at the base of his throat, the beginning of something that continued beneath the fabric. He stopped in the middle of the room and looked at her with eyes that were doing the same thing she had just spent 5 minutes doing, taking inventory. His expression was not unkind. It was not kind either. It was the expression of a man who had learned early that the difference between a threat and an opportunity often lived in information he didn't have yet, and who had trained himself to withhold judgment long enough to gather it. He asked 3 questions. He asked them in the flat, evenly spaced way of someone who had decided in advance that he would receive answers. Who sent you? What do you want? Why did you shield her? The first 2, Racheal understood she could answer 100 different ways and none of them would fully satisfy a man who had built his life around the assumption that everyone in a room had a reason for being there that served their own interests first. She was too tired for the versions that might sound more convincing. She was too tired, frankly, for anything that required construction. So she answered the 3rd one. And she answered it the only way she knew how, which was plainly and without apology, and without the softening language she had learned to wrap honest things in when she needed the person across from her to be comfortable receiving them. She said, "She reminded me of every grandmother I watched come into that restaurant alone. Women who ordered carefully and ate slowly and never asked for anything twice because they had spent their whole lives not wanting to be a burden to anyone. That's all. There's nothing else." The room went quiet, not the quiet of the house around them, that disciplined, trained silence. A different kind. The kind that settles over a space when a sentence has landed that the person who asked the question did not prepare a response for. When the answer given is so far outside the architecture of the interrogation that the interrogation doesn't know what to do next. Tae-sung looked at her. He had very good control of his face. She could see that clearly. But there was something in the few seconds that followed her answer, something that moved just beneath the surface of that control, the way current moves beneath water that looks still from above, that told Racheal her answer had gone somewhere he hadn't expected it to go. He didn't fill the silence. Neither did she. Outside the window, the courtyard garden held its careful peace, and the water caught the light, and the morning continued without asking either of them what they intended to do with it. The second day was quieter than the first, which Racheal hadn't thought was possible until she woke into it. She had slept in pieces, an hour here, 2 hours there, the shoulder pulling her back to the surface every time she rolled toward the left without meaning to. By the time the pale light coming through the courtyard window had settled into something that looked like mid-morning, she had given up on sleep as a project and simply lay still, listening to the house move around her in its careful, disciplined way. Footsteps that stopped before they reached her door. The distant sound of something being prepared in a kitchen she hadn't seen. A phone ringing once, briefly, and then not again. She was not a woman who had ever been good at stillness. At the Hannock, stillness meant a table needed something and she hadn't noticed yet. In the apartment she rented on the east side, stillness meant the upstairs neighbor had finally stopped moving furniture at 11 at night, which happened rarely enough to feel suspicious. Stillness, in Racheal's experience, was usually the thing right before something else. But the robe was soft, and the shoulder ached at a level she had decided to manage rather than resist, and sometime in the second hour of lying still she found the receipt. It was tucked into the robe's left pocket, a small paper, creased from being folded twice, from what looked like a dry cleaner on the north side of the city. Blank on the back. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at the courtyard garden through the window, and then she got up and found the short pencil she had noticed the evening before in the slim drawer of the bedside table, the kind hotels and careful households keep alongside a notepad they had not thought to include here. She stood at the window in the borrowed robe with the receipt pressed against the glass and began to draw the garden. She was not a skilled artist. She had never claimed to be. But she had always been able to look at a space and understand its structure, where the weight was, where the light moved, which lines were doing the real work of holding the whole thing together. The garden below had a Japanese influence modified by something more personal, she thought. The stone paths were too irregular for pure formality. Someone had chosen the plantings with feeling as well as knowledge. There was a small stone bench near the water feature that sat at an angle slightly off from where a designer would have placed it, which meant someone had moved it after the fact to a position that felt right rather than correct. She was working on the bench when she heard the door open behind her. She didn't startle. She had learned a long time ago that startling in front of people who were watching to see how you reacted was a form of information she preferred to keep. She turned, and it was not Taesung. Yoon Young-sun moved into the room without announcing herself and without the quality of intrusion. In the way of a woman who had spent enough years inside a space to understand that her presence in any room of it was not a question requiring permission. She was smaller than Racheal remembered from the restaurant floor, or perhaps the restaurant floor had been a different kind of encounter, one that expanded everything. She wore a simple gray cardigan over a pale blouse, her silver hair neatly arranged, her face carrying the composed and unhurried expression of someone for whom the events of 2 nights ago had been absorbed and were now being carried in the place she had designated for them rather than worn on the surface where they would inconvenience others. She was holding 2 cups. She set one on the windowsill beside Racheal's receipt without comment, took the chair near the window for herself, and sat. She didn't look at Racheal immediately. She looked at the garden below, wrapping both hands around her own cup, and let the silence exist without making any move to fill it. Racheal looked at the cup. It was a pale amber color, slightly sweet-smelling, with a warmth that moved up through her palms when she picked it up. She drank without asking what it was, because she had been raised to accept what was offered by people who offered things without needing to perform the offering, and because her body, still in the process of reknitting itself around a wound, wanted the warmth in a way that bypassed preference. It was persimmon tea. She identified it from the Hannock's menu, where it appeared in the autumn section under warming drinks. She had carried it to dozens of tables without ever having been offered it herself. They sat like that for a while. Long enough that the quality of the silence changed from the silence of 2 strangers in a room to something that required less management from both of them. Young-sun spoke first. She asked about the drawing on the receipt, without preamble, in the direct and genuinely curious way of someone who had decided that social scaffolding was a resource she no longer needed to spend on small questions. Racheal told her about the bench. The angle of it. How it looked like someone had moved it from where it was supposed to be to where it needed to be, and that she had always found that kind of decision interesting. The decision to trust feeling over plan. Young-sun looked at the bench for a moment. Then she said, without particular emphasis, that she had moved it herself. 3 years ago. The designer had placed it where the sight lines were correct and the proportions were balanced, and she had sat on it once and felt nothing, and so she had moved it 18 inches to the left until the garden felt like somewhere a person actually was rather than somewhere a person was meant to look at. Racheal nodded. She understood that completely. What followed was not the kind of conversation Racheal had expected to have in this house. It was not an interrogation dressed in warmth, not a performance of concern designed to extract something. It was simply two women, one young and one old, talking beside a window about a garden and then about other things, with the ease that occasionally and unexpectedly arrives between people who recognize something in each other that neither of them has fully named yet. Young-sun spoke about Atlanta. The version of it she had arrived in 30 years ago as a young woman following a husband whose ambition she had understood, and whose methods she had learned about slowly, the way you learn about weather in a new country, by living through it rather than being warned about it first. She spoke about what she had built inside the life she'd been handed, the garden, the small foundation she ran for first-generation college students, the habit of dining alone on Tuesdays because Tuesday had been her husband's least favorite day and keeping it for herself had felt, after he was gone, like a small and private form of reclamation. She did not speak about Taesung for a long time. When she did, it arrived without transition, in the middle of a quiet that had grown comfortable enough to hold something real. She said that she had watched her son become capable before he became anything else. That capable was a good thing to be, and she did not regret the parts of it that had kept him safe. But that there was a point, she had come to understand, at which capability without softness stops being armor and starts being a room with no doors. And she was not certain her son knew yet how long he had been standing in that room. She looked at the garden when she said it, not at Racheal. He learned to survive, she said. Her voice was not bitter. It was not even sad in the sharp way of grief. It was the particular heaviness of a woman who has had a long time to sit with the consequences of a decision she made from love and insufficient information, and who has learned to carry the weight of it without putting it down, and without pretending it isn't there. I'm still waiting, she said, to see if he'll learn to live. The courtyard held its quiet below them. The stone bench sat at its 18-inch deviation from the plan, and the water caught the light, and Racheal held the cup of persimmon tea in both hands and did not say anything for a moment, because some sentences deserve the space to finish landing before anything else is placed beside them. Then she said, quietly and without intending it to be more than the truth, I know what it is to survive something so long you forget that was never supposed to be the whole point. Young-sun looked at her. Then. Not the polite look of someone acknowledging a contribution to a conversation. The full, unhurried look of a woman who has just heard something she recognized from the inside. She didn't respond with words. She simply nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone confirming something they already knew but needed to hear said aloud by another person before they could fully believe they hadn't imagined it. Outside, the garden continued to be exactly what it was, not perfect, not symmetrical, but arranged with feeling rather than only with plan, which was, Racheal was beginning to understand, the only kind of arrangement that ever really held. Racheal had never thought of herself as someone who investigated things. That word belonged to other kinds of people, people with credentials and authority, people who had been given permission to ask questions and expect answers. What Racheal did was simpler and older than investigation. She noticed. She had been noticing since she was 9 years old and learning to read the particular quality of her mother's silence that meant the electricity bill hadn't been paid versus the silence that meant something harder was coming. Noticing was not a skill she had chosen. It was the thing that had chosen her, early and without asking, because her circumstances had made it necessary before she was old enough to understand that not everyone lived at that level of attention. 2 years of nursing school had given that noticing a framework. She had learned to look at a body and read what it was telling her before it had words for it. The way a person held an injured limb, the subtle asymmetry of a face hiding pain, the specific quality of stillness that meant someone was managing something rather than being comfortable. She had been good at that part. Her clinical supervisor in her second year had told her she had the instincts of someone who had been doing this work for decades, which Racheal had accepted with a nod and understood privately as the instincts of someone who had spent her childhood in rooms where reading the situation correctly was not academic. Hospitality had finished the education nursing school had started. 2 years of moving through a restaurant where the guests were wealthy enough to have learned how to hide everything had taught her to read the spaces between what people said and what they meant, the difference between a man who was relaxed and a man who was performing relaxation, the way a table of people changed their behavior when they thought the waitress had moved out of earshot. She had learned more about human nature carrying plates than she had ever learned in a classroom. And she had learned it the way you learn things when the lesson isn't optional. So Racheal did not investigate. She simply continued to notice, and she let what she noticed accumulate until it had enough weight to mean something. She had been permitted, by the 4th day, to move through certain parts of the compound during her recovery. The courtyard garden, the long corridor connecting the residential wing to the main sitting rooms, the kitchen during the hours when the household staff used it least. She moved through these spaces slowly and with the unhurried quality of a woman who was simply stretching a healing shoulder, which was true enough. She also moved through them paying attention, which she did not advertise. She asked small questions of the staff, in the easy sideways manner she had developed at the Hammock for learning things from people who hadn't decided yet whether to tell her, not direct questions that announced themselves as questions, but the kind that arrived inside ordinary conversation and were gone before anyone noticed they had been asked. She asked a kitchen staff member about the Hammock, whether people from the household ate there often, whether it was a regular arrangement, or occasional. She asked one of the household staff who passed her in the corridor about the neighborhood near the restaurant, framing it as curiosity about Atlanta, which was true enough to feel natural. She asked Young-sun, over persimmon tea on the 4th afternoon, about the dinner at the Hammock. Not about the shooting. She understood without being told that the shooting was not a subject that would open easily, but about the evening itself. Whether it had been planned or spontaneous. Whether Young-sun often dined there alone. Young-sun told her that she went to the Hammock every few weeks, always on a Tuesday, always alone, and always at the same corner table near the window that the restaurant held for her by arrangement because she liked the light, and she liked being near the garden view that the restaurant's east wall offered. She had a standing preference, not a reservation. She would call ahead that afternoon if she intended to come that evening. Racheal held that piece of information carefully and didn't take it out again until she had more to place beside it. What she learned next came not from a conversation but from a document she was not meant to see and would not have seen if the household's administrative assistant had not left the corridor workstation unlocked while stepping away for 4 minutes to manage something in the east wing. Racheal had not gone looking. She had simply been passing, and the screen had been facing the corridor, and the thing on it had been visible to anyone with eyes and the habit of reading what was in front of them. It was a call log. Internal Directory Yoon Organization. She understood that from the header, which was in both Korean and English. She did not read Korean, but she read numbers, and the entry timestamped at 4:47 on the afternoon of the Tuesday in question showed an outbound call to the Hammock's reservation line from an internal extension she did not yet have a name for. She kept walking. She did not stop, did not slow, did not give the screen a second look that anyone observing would have called interest. She went to the garden and sat on Young-sun's repositioned bench and let the information find its place among the other things she had been carrying. The corner table near the window with the garden view. The one Young-sun always preferred, the one held by standing arrangement that required no reservation because it was simply always kept for her. That was the table with the light she liked and the view she returned to, and it was also the table positioned farthest from the restaurant's main sidelines and closest to the private dining corridor. The corridor that ran behind the east wall and was known, she understood from 4 days of small questions and accumulated noticing, only to the reservation management and the senior staff. The shooter's angle had not been accidental. You could not have taken that shot from the position the police report described. She had heard enough of the household's security discussion through corridor walls to understand the general geometry, without knowing that a specific woman would be sitting at a specific table at a specific time. A table she never formally reserved. A table that had been shifted by a call from an internal number made that same afternoon, from its standing arrangement to a confirmed booking for the evening. Someone who had access to the UN organization's internal directory had called the Hannock that afternoon and confirmed the table. Someone inside had arranged the room before she arrived. Racheal sat with this for a long time. Long enough for the light in the garden to shift from afternoon into the early amber of early evening. Long enough to be certain she had not assembled the pieces in the wrong order or given them a shape they didn't actually have. Then she went to find Young-sun. She found her in the small sitting room off the residential corridor, the lamp already lit against the fading light outside, a book open on her knee at a page she had clearly not been reading. Young-sun looked up when Racheal came in, and something in her face, a quiet alertness, the expression of a woman who had been waiting without admitting to herself that she was waiting, settled into attention. Racheal sat across from her and told her what she had found. Not in the manner of someone delivering an accusation or building toward a dramatic conclusion. In the flat, sequenced way she had learned in nursing school for reporting what she had observed, this, then this, then this, and here is what those three things mean when placed beside each other. She spoke about the table, the standing arrangement, the internal call, the shooter's angle and what it required someone to have known in advance. She did not name Minjun. She did not have enough to name anyone yet. She laid down only what she could verify and stopped precisely where her certainty stopped, which was, she had always believed, the only honest way to tell a difficult truth. Young-sun listened without moving. Without the small adjustments people make when they are processing, the slight shift in posture, the almost interruption held back, the eyes moving away to think. She sat completely still, her hands quiet in her lap, and listened until Racheal finished. The silence afterward was not the silence of shock. It was something older and heavier than shock. It was the silence of a woman hearing confirmed, in clean and sequential language, the outline of something she had been refusing to look at directly for longer than she wanted to count. Not because she hadn't seen its shape, but because some shapes, once named, cannot be unnamed. And she had not been ready, until this moment, for what the naming would require. Her face did not fall. It settled, the way a person's face settles when the thing they feared most turns out to be real, and the energy they had been spending on hoping it wasn't can finally be put down. She looked at Racheal for a long moment without speaking. And in her eyes, behind the composure she had been carrying for 70 years and had no intention of abandoning now, was the expression of a woman recognizing the exact shape of what she had been afraid, for months, to call by its name. She waited until after dinner, when the compound had settled into its evening rhythm and the sound of the household had thinned to the few quiet movements of night staff completing their last tasks. She waited not because she needed more time to prepare what she was going to say. She had known how she was going to say it since she left Young-sun's sitting room, but because she understood, from years of working rooms where timing was the difference between a conversation that landed and one that didn't, that a man like Tae-sung would receive difficult information better when the day's other demands had cleared from the space around him. She knocked this time. She had decided that was important. Not because she thought the knocking would go unnoticed as a choice, but because she wanted to make it clearly, to establish from the first second that she was not arriving as a supplicant, not arriving with her hands already open, but as someone who had something to say and was extending the courtesy of announcing herself before she said it. His voice came through the door after a brief pause. She went in. The office was a serious room, not cold, but without anything in it that wasn't doing work. Dark shelving, a wide desk that held 3 things and no more, a window that looked out over the front of the compound where the private road curved away into the dark between the trees. Tae-sung was standing rather than sitting, one hand resting on the edge of the desk, reviewing something on the screen angled toward him. He looked up when she entered and waited in the particular way she had come to recognize as his version of an invitation, not welcoming, not unwelcoming, simply present and willing to receive what was coming. Racheal stood on the near side of the desk and told him everything. She told it the way she had been trained to tell things that mattered, the method she had practiced in her 2 years of clinical rotations. Standing at the foot of a bed or in a corridor outside a room, delivering a patient report to a physician who needed the information complete, and in the correct sequence, and entirely free of the speaker's feelings about it. She had been good at that. She had found, to her own surprise, that the discipline of it was not a constraint but a relief, the relief of a format that trusted the facts to carry their own weight without assistance. She began with the chrysanthemums. The specific cultural meaning she had not known until she asked, and what that meaning suggested about the intention behind the gesture. She moved to the reservation, Young-sun's standing arrangement, the corner table that had never required a booking, and the call made from an internal Yoon directory number to the Hanok on the afternoon of the shooting to confirm it as a formal reservation for that evening. She described Minjun's visit, the calibration of it, the rhythm of questions designed to sound like concern while building a picture of what she knew and how close she was to the people she had been placed among. She noted his timing, the way his answers arrived slightly ahead of the natural pace of conversation, the specific tell of a man who had rehearsed the responses because he already knew what the questions would be. She did not editorialize. She did not say what she believed it meant, or what she thought he should do with it. She placed each piece down in the order she had found it, and stopped when she reached the end of what she could verify, which was the only honest place to stop. When she finished, the room was quiet. She had expected a version of quiet. She had not expected this specific version, and she recognized it the moment it arrived. It was not the quiet of a man absorbing new information, not the processing silence, the thinking silence, the silence that precedes a question or a conclusion. It was heavier than that and stiller. It was the quiet of a man who had just been handed something that, if true, would require him to take apart something he had built himself around. Not his organization. Himself. The version of himself that had decided, at some point in the last 15 years, that Minjun was the fixed point in a world where everything else was a variable. Taesung looked at her for a long moment. His face held the same controlled surface it always held. But something in his eyes was doing the work of a man who was not ready for what she had just placed in front of him, and was not going to let that unreadiness show, and was going to find the most measured possible way to set the whole thing at a manageable distance. He said, "You've been here 6 days. 3 words that were not 3 words. They were 15 years stated as a counterweight. They were the architecture of trust that predated her, the accumulated history she had no access to and no standing in and no way to compete with on the basis of duration alone." He was not calling her dishonest. That would have been easier to absorb. He was saying something more precise and more painful, that the math of time and proximity and established loyalty did not currently work in her favor, and that he was a man who had survived this long by not abandoning that math for the account of someone whose presence in his house was 6 days old, and whose reason for being there was an act he still had not found a framework sufficient to explain. He was not wrong to think it. Racheal knew that. She understood the logic completely, could follow it from its premise to its conclusion without losing the thread once. A man in his position who discarded 15 years of established trust on the basis of 6 days, and a woman he could not categorize, would not be a man who had built what he had built. He would be a liability. His skepticism was, by the internal rules of his world, not only reasonable but correct. Knowing something is reasonable does not make it land without weight. She nodded once. The nod she had developed over years of being in rooms where the decision had already been made and the only dignified thing left was to acknowledge it without performing either acceptance or defeat. The nod that said, "I have said what needed to be said. What happens next is not mine to carry." She left. She pulled the door closed behind her with the same care she had given to the knock, deliberately, without drama, in the manner of someone who understood that how you leave a room is as much a statement as how you enter it. The hallway was long and lit at its low evening setting and entirely, expensively quiet around her. She walked a few steps and then stopped. Not because she needed to collect herself, she was, on the surface, collected. She stopped because something had arrived in her chest that she hadn't been expecting and hadn't had time to prepare a place for. It hurt, not in the way she was accustomed to being hurt, which was the dull familiar ache of not mattering to a room, of being useful and invisible in equal measure, of being the kind of person whose absence would be noticed only in terms of what needed to be covered. She was used to that. She had built a life inside that particular hurt and learned to make it livable. This was different. This was specific and new and located precisely, and when she stood still in the hallway and let herself feel the shape of it, she understood what it was. Somewhere in 6 days, in persimmon tea and courtyard light, and the bench moved 18 inches from where it was supposed to be, she had started caring whether this man believed her. Not because he was powerful, and she was not. Not because she needed something from him, or feared what he could do. But because something in this house had begun to feel, quietly and without her permission, like a place where being seen was possible. And she had let herself want that, just slightly, just enough, and she had realized she wanted it at exactly the moment the door closed on the evidence that she didn't yet have it. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she straightened, adjusted the soft robe at her uninjured shoulder, and walked back toward her room in the even, unhurried way of a woman who had been here before, not in this hallway, not in this house, but in this feeling, and who knew, from experience, how to keep moving through it without letting it take her knees. Tae-sung did not go to sleep after Racheal left his office. He stood at the desk for a while after the door closed. In the particular stillness of a man who has just received something he is not ready to put down, and is not ready to fully pick up. Then he sat, opened his laptop, and pulled the internal directory log for the Hanok reservation system, not because he had decided to believe her, but because he was a man who had survived this long by verifying rather than assuming, and the discipline of that applied equally in both directions. It took him 4 minutes to find the entry. Outbound call, internal extension, timestamp of 4:47 on the afternoon of the Tuesday in question. The extension resolved in the directory to a secondary line registered under operational communications, a category broad enough to have legitimate traffic passing through it daily, narrow enough that the people with access to it numbered fewer than a dozen. He stared at the screen without touching anything else for a long time, in the way of a man reading a sentence that is clear and grammatically simple and that he is nonetheless reading again because his mind keeps arriving at the end of it, and refusing to accept the meaning. He had built the directory himself. 12 years ago, when he was restructuring the organization's internal communications to remove vulnerabilities, he had designed the access architecture and assigned every extension personally. He knew who held each line the way a man knows the contents of a room he has lived in long enough, not by consulting a list but by the prior knowledge that lives in the body. The extension on the screen belonged to a phone that sat on a desk he had stood beside hundreds of times. In an office 2 floors below this one. He closed the laptop. He did not pick up his phone. There was a version of this moment in which he called someone, initiated a verification process, began the formal machinery of investigation that his organization had protocols for. He did not do that. He understood, in the cold and precise way that he understood most things, that the machinery of investigation could be observed by the person it was investigating, and that the person whose extension was on that log had been inside the machinery long enough to recognize its sounds from a distance. He sat without moving for another few minutes. Then he got up, left the office, and walked to the far end of the residential wing. The lamp in his mother's sitting room was still lit. He could see the line of yellow light beneath the door from the end of the corridor. He knocked once, briefly, and went in. Young-sun was in the chair she always occupied in the evenings, the one angled slightly toward the window rather than directly facing the room, a book open across her knee. She looked up when he entered. She did not look surprised to see him, which was itself a form of information. His mother had always had a quality of unsurprise at the things that mattered, as though some part of her had been quietly tracking their approach long before they arrived. She closed the book without marking her page. She set it on the side table. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. She did not ask why he had come. She did not offer tea or any of the social constructions she used in conversations that required easing into. She simply waited in the way of a woman who had known her son for 34 years and understood, from the specific quality of how he had knocked, and how he was standing now just inside the door, that he had come for something other than the things he usually came to her with. He came to her rarely, and when he did it was most often to deliver something, an update, a reassurance, the management of information that he believed she needed to have and have correctly. He came to give. He did not often come to ask. Tonight he was asking. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, which were carrying something they were working not to show. He sat in the chair across from hers and told her what Racheal had reported. He told it the way he handled all information, compact, sequenced, without editorializing. The table arrangement. The internal call. The chrysanthemums and what they signified. The pattern of Minjun's visits to Racheal, the calibration of them, the rhythm that someone with a particular kind of experience had recognized as performance rather than genuine concern. He included the extension number. He left nothing out and added nothing that wasn't there. When he finished, his mother was quiet, not the brief quiet of someone collecting their thoughts. The longer quiet of a woman arriving at the end of a road she had been walking for some time and finding, at the end of it, the thing she had known was there but had kept hoping might resolve into something else before she reached it. She looked at her hands in her lap. She looked at the window, where the dark outside held nothing visible, only the faint reflection of the lamp and the two of them inside it. Then she looked at her son. She said the night at the restaurant, "I didn't tell Minjun I was going alone. I told no one except the reservations line when I called that afternoon to let them know I was coming." She paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a woman who had been carrying a sentence for months and was now setting it down for the first time, and needed a moment to feel the difference between holding it and releasing it. "He was the first one to call me after the shooting," she said. "Before you. Before anyone else whose number I know. Before the staff here, before the security team. Within 4 minutes of the shot, while I was still on the restaurant floor." She did not say what that meant. She had learned, over a long life, that the most important things rarely needed annotation. Either the person across from you could see it or they couldn't, and if they could, pointing at it was a kind of insult to the intelligence of what had just been understood. The room held the sentence the way rooms hold things that have been too long held back, completely, and with a kind of relief that was also its own form of sorrow. Taesung sat very still. He was looking at his mother, but she understood he was seeing something that was not in the room with them, or rather, something that had been in the room, had been in every room for 15 years, and that he was only now, in this specific lamplit moment, allowing himself to see clearly and without the buffer of loyalty and history and the particular blindness of trusting someone so long that trust stops being a choice and becomes a condition you live inside without examining. She watched his face do the work that his face rarely did in front of anyone. The controlled surface held, because it always held, because he had built it to hold. But beneath the surface something shifted in the way of something large and slow that has been in the same position for a very long time, and has finally begun to move. Not collapse. Not fracture. Move, in the way that means the ground underneath a thing has changed and the thing above it must eventually acknowledge that, whether it is ready to or not. Young-sun did not reach across and touch his hand, though she wanted to. She understood that her son received comfort best when it was not announced, when it arrived as presence rather than gesture, as the simple fact of being in the same room with someone who had known you long enough that nothing you showed them required explanation. So she sat, and she let him have the silence, and she was there inside it with him. He was looking somewhere past the window now. Past the dark and the reflection of the lamp, past the immediate evening into something she could not see. The shape of but recognized by the quality of his stillness, the stillness of a man placing things beside each other that he has been keeping in separate rooms for too long, and finally allowing them to occupy the same space. She knew, without him saying it, when it arrived. The moment the face arrived. The woman in the red uniform. The one who had walked into a situation that was not hers to walk into, and had not walked back out of it, not when she could have, not when she had been given reasons to. The one who had come to his office 6 days into a life she had no map for and laid down a truth in clean and sequential language and then nodded, once, without drama, without pleading, and left. Young-sun had seen the nod. She had heard about it from no one. She simply knew, with the knowledge that mothers carry in the place beneath language, that a woman who could produce that particular nod in that particular moment was not someone her son was going to be able to categorize and file and set at the managed distance he set most things. She watched his jaw tighten very slightly. She watched him exhale, slow and controlled, the way he exhaled when he was absorbing something he had decided not to resist any further. Then he looked at her, and she looked back at him. And between them in the warm yellow light of the small lamp was the wordless and complete understanding of two people who have known each other long enough that the most important things have always lived in the silence between the sentences rather than in the sentences themselves. He stayed for another few minutes. He did not say much else. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door with his hand on the frame, a gesture so brief and uncharacteristic that she almost didn't catch it, and looked back at her with the expression of a man who wants to say something he doesn't yet have the right word for. He didn't say it. He left. But Young Sun sat in the lamplit room long after the sound of his footsteps had faded down the corridor, and she looked at the dark window and the reflection of herself in it, and she allowed herself, quietly and without telling anyone, to feel something she had not let herself feel in a very long time, something that was, if she was honest, very close to hope. Minjun Seo had always understood that the difference between a plan that succeeded and a plan that failed was not intelligence or resources or timing, though all three mattered. It was the ability to identify, in the early stages, which variables were manageable and which were not, and to eliminate the unmanageable ones before they became the reason everything else came apart. He had run this calculation many times over the past 2 years. He had run it with the patience of a man who understood that the most dangerous operations were the ones that moved too fast, and with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years inside an organization learning exactly where its weight was distributed and exactly which points, if removed, would cause the whole structure to shift. He knew this organization the way a builder knows a building he has constructed with his own hands, not from the blueprints but from the inside, from the feel of it, from the memory of every decision made during its construction and every compromise that had been built into its walls. The variable he had not calculated was Racheal Williams, not because she was extraordinary in any way he should have anticipated. That was the precise and infuriating quality of the problem she represented. She was not a security specialist, not a trained operative, not someone whose background should have flagged her as a threat to anything he was doing. She was a waitress with an incomplete nursing degree and a healing bullet wound, and he had dismissed her with the same efficient inattention he gave to anything that did not appear in the column of things requiring management. That dismissal was the most expensive mistake he had made in 15 years. He understood, by the evening of the 8th day, that his window was closing. He could read the compound's atmosphere the way he had always read it. He had been inside it long enough that its moods were legible to him before they surfaced in any observable behavior. Something had shifted in Taesung's movement through the house that afternoon. A quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. A particular quality of inward attention that Minjun recognized as the attention of a man who was verifying something. Not investigating, not yet the formal machinery, but checking. Quietly and personally checking, which was more dangerous than the formal machinery because it left no trail of its own. He did not move against Taesung. That had never been the plan, and it was not the plan now. He moved against the variable. The framing was clean, a rival faction, an extraction attempt, someone who had witnessed the Hanok shooting and needed to be removed before she could be used as a formal witness by people whose interest in destabilizing the Yoon operation ran parallel to the legal system. It was the kind of threat the compound's security architecture was designed to address in a specific way, contained, handled internally, reported after resolution rather than before. It was the kind of thing that, handled correctly, would increase Taesung's sense of external threat and draw his attention outward, away from the interior of his own house, precisely at the moment when inward attention was the thing Minjun could least afford. 2 Men. The residential wing corridor, East End. 2 in the morning, when the night staff's rotation created a 4-minute gap in the corridor's coverage that Minjun knew about because he had designed the security rotation himself, 8 years ago, and had never recommended its revision. He had not accounted for the fact that Racheal Williams had been mapping the compound's rhythms since the first day she was permitted to move through it. She came awake at 1:58 without an alarm and without the slow surfacing of ordinary waking. She came awake the way she had learned to come awake in the apartment on the east side, where the building's sounds were specific enough that an unfamiliar one registered before she was fully conscious. the difference between the upstairs neighbor's particular footfall and a stranger's weight on the same floor, between the pipes she knew and a pressure change she didn't. The compound had its own sounds. She had been cataloging them without deciding to, because cataloging the sounds of a space was what she did when she was in a space that wasn't hers and she needed to understand it well enough to be safe inside it. By day 3 she knew the sound of the night staff's movement, the specific interval of the corridor checks, the mechanical sound the East Wing's climate system made at the turn of every hour, the rhythm of the building settling in the early morning cold. The sound that woke her did not belong to any of those categories. It was the sound of a door opening with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that speed creates noise and had therefore removed speed from the equation. A careful sound. A practiced sound. The sound of someone who had thought about this specific door in advance. She was out of the bed before she had finished identifying it, moving in the dark with the particular economy of someone who has already, in the better-lit hours of previous days, memorized where every piece of furniture sat and what the floor felt like between them. She did not turn on a light. She stood inside the darkness of the room and thought clearly and quickly about what she had and what she didn't have. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have full use of her left shoulder, which had been progressing well for 8 days and would now, she understood, be asked to do something it was not finished recovering from. She didn't have size or training or the accumulated physical advantage of people who had spent years preparing for moments like this. She had the floor plan of the corridor outside her door, which she had walked enough times to know in her body rather than her memory. She had the medication delivery schedule for the room directly across the hall. The compound's attending medical staff delivered the household's elderly groundskeeper his 2 a.m. cardiac medication with a consistency she had noted on day 4 because consistency in medical schedules was something her nursing training had made her automatically track. That delivery was due in 90 seconds and would require the corridor light to be switched on from the panel at the corridor's midpoint. She had the maintenance access panel she had found on day 3 in the alcove 12 feet from her door, behind the decorative panel that didn't sit quite flush with the wall because it had been replaced at some point with a piece cut 2 millimeters too narrow. She had found it because she had run her hand along the wall while walking slowly during a recovery stretch, the way you run your hand along a wall when you have nothing specific to do and your hands need something. She had opened it out of the mild and aimless curiosity of someone spending too much time in a confined space, and she had seen the fire suppression manual override inside it, and she had closed it again and continued her walk and filed the information in the place where she kept things that had no immediate use but were too specific to forget. She had 2 years of clinical anatomy and the specific knowledge, from her second semester, of a cluster of nerves in the radial aspect of the wrist that, compressed at the correct angle with the correct brief force, caused involuntary release of whatever the hand was holding. She had practiced it on herself during study, the way nursing students practice assessment techniques, until she could find it in the dark. She stood in the doorway of her room as the 2 men came down the corridor, and she let them come, and she waited with the patience of someone who understood that the only advantage she had was the one they had given her by not considering her worth preparing for. The corridor light came on at 2:03, the night staff member crossing to deliver the cardiac medication, and in the half-second of adjustment that any set of eyes makes when light arrives unexpectedly in darkness, Racheal moved. She didn't move toward the closer man. She moved toward the farther one, the one on her left, because her clinical eye had spent 4 days cataloging the way Minjun's people carried themselves, and this man held his weapon in his right hand with the left held slightly away from the body in the specific way of someone who had a shoulder that didn't rotate fully, an old injury, partially compensated, creating a blind side he probably no longer thought about consciously because the body adapts and makes its limitations feel like normal. She found the wrist. She found the nerve cluster in the dark by structure rather than sight, compressed it at the correct angle, and the hand opened. The sound the weapon made hitting the corridor floor was enough to pull the first man's attention sideways for the 2 seconds she needed to drive her right elbow backward into the alcove panel, pop it open, and hit the manual override with the flat of her palm. The suppression system activated with the sound and force of something that had been waiting under pressure for precisely this kind of invitation. The corridor filled with cold and noise and the specific chaos of a system designed to override every other consideration in the building. And in the chaos, Racheal put her back against the wall, pressed her right hand to her left shoulder where the wound had announced itself with the sharp clarity of an injury that had not finished healing and was not interested in being ignored, and held her position. She did not run. There was nowhere to run. She held her position and waited, which was what she did when she had done everything she could do and the rest was no longer in her hands. The door at the end of the corridor came open 40 seconds later. Taesung came through it, moving in a way she had not seen him move before. Not the dense, pressurized walk of a man for whom the air clears in advance, but something faster and less controlled than that. Something that her mind catalogued quietly and without comment as the movement of a man who had stopped calculating the appearance of the thing and was simply moving toward it as fast as his body would carry him. He stopped when he saw the corridor, the two men on the floor, the open maintenance panel, the suppression system still cycling through its process in the cold, wet air, and Racheal against the wall, her right hand pressed to her left shoulder, her feet planted, her face arranged in the expression of someone who had been right about something that had cost considerably more than being right usually costs, and who was too tired and too much in pain to dress that fact in anything more comfortable than what it was. He looked at the corridor for a long moment. He looked at her. She looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the corridor had not already said more clearly than she could. He was still breathing harder than she had ever seen him breathe. He looked at her hand pressed to her shoulder, and something moved across his face that his control caught quickly, but not quite quickly enough, not quickly enough for someone who had spent 8 days learning to read the fraction of a second before his control arrived. Then he looked at her for one more moment, and his jaw settled, and he said one word. Minjun. Not a question. Not a command yet. The word of a man who has just finished the last verification he needed and has now arrived, fully and without remaining doubt, at the only conclusion the evidence had ever been pointing toward. The word landed in the corridor between them and did not require anything added to it. Racheal held her shoulder and breathed and said nothing, because the word had not been directed at her. It had been directed at the shape of what he now understood, which was larger than this corridor and older than tonight, and had been waiting in the architecture of his own trust for longer than either of them wanted to calculate. She had been right. She had been right 6 days ago, and the cost of the delay between then and now was soaking through the fabric pressed under her right hand, and she was not going to say that out loud. And she did not need to, and she suspected, from the specific quality of the way he was looking at her now, which was different from every other way he had looked at her in 8 days, that he already knew it better than she needed to tell him. Minjun Seo had always understood that the difference between a plan that succeeded and a plan that failed was not intelligence, or resources, or timing, though all three mattered. It was the ability to identify, in the early stages, which variables were manageable and which were not, and to eliminate the unmanageable ones before they became the reason everything else came apart. He had run this calculation many times over the past 2 years. He had run it with the patience of a man who understood that the most dangerous operations were the ones that moved too fast, and with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years inside an organization learning exactly where its weight was distributed and exactly which points, if removed, would cause the whole structure to shift. He knew this organization the way a builder knows a building he has constructed with his own hands, not from the blueprints but from the inside, from the feel of it, from the memory of every decision made during its construction and every compromise that had been built into its walls. The variable he had not calculated was Racheal Williams, not because she was extraordinary in any way he should have anticipated. That was the precise and infuriating quality of the problem she represented. She was not a security specialist, not a trained operative, not someone whose background should have flagged her as a threat to anything he was doing. She was a waitress with an incomplete nursing degree and a healing bullet wound, and he had dismissed her with the same efficient inattention he gave to anything that did not appear in the column of things requiring management. That dismissal was the most expensive mistake he had made in 15 years. He understood, by the evening of the 8th day, that his window was closing. He could read the compound's atmosphere the way he had always read it, He had been inside it long enough that its moods were legible to him before they surfaced in any observable behavior. Something had shifted in Taesung's movement through the house that afternoon. A quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, a particular quality of inward attention that Min-jun recognized as the attention of a man who was verifying something. Not investigating, not yet the formal machinery, but checking. Quietly and personally checking, which was more dangerous than the formal machinery because it left no trail of its own. He did not move against Taesung. That had never been the plan, and it was not the plan now. He moved against the variable. The framing was clean, a rival faction, an extraction attempt, someone who had witnessed the Hanok shooting and needed to be removed before she could be used as a formal witness by people whose interest in destabilizing the Yoon operation ran parallel to the legal system. It was the kind of threat the compound's security architecture was designed to address in a specific way, contained, handled internally, reported after resolution rather than before. It was the kind of thing that, handled correctly, would increase Taesung's sense of external threat and draw his attention outward, away from the interior of his own house, precisely at the moment when inward attention was the thing Min-jun could least afford. 2 Men. The residential wing corridor, East End. 2 in the morning, when the night staff's rotation created a 4-minute gap in the corridor's coverage that Min-jun knew about because he had designed the security rotation himself, 8 years ago, and had never recommended its revision. He had not accounted for the fact that Racheal Williams had been mapping the compound's rhythms since the first day she was permitted to move through it. She came awake at 1:58 without an alarm and without the slow surfacing of ordinary waking. She came awake the way she had learned to come awake in the apartment on the east side, where the building's sounds were specific enough that an unfamiliar one registered before she was fully conscious. The difference between the upstairs neighbor's particular footfall and a stranger's weight on the same floor, between the pipes she knew and a pressure change she didn't. The compound had its own sounds. She had been cataloging them without deciding to, because cataloging the sounds of a space was what she did when she was in a space that wasn't hers and she needed to understand it well enough to be safe inside it. By day 3 she knew the sound of the night staff's movement, the specific interval of the corridor checks, the mechanical sound the East Wing's climate system made at the turn of every hour, the rhythm of the building settling in the early morning cold. The sound that woke her did not belong to any of those categories. It was the sound of a door opening with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that speed creates noise and had therefore removed speed from the equation. A careful sound. A practiced sound. The sound of someone who had thought about this specific door in advance. She was out of the bed before she had finished identifying it, moving in the dark with the particular economy of someone who has already, in the better lit hours of previous days, memorized where every piece of furniture sat and what the floor felt like between them. She did not turn on a light. She stood inside the darkness of the room and thought clearly and quickly about what she had and what she didn't have. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have full use of her left shoulder, which had been progressing well for 8 days and would now, she understood, be asked to do something it was not finished recovering from. She didn't have size or training or the accumulated physical advantage of people who had spent years preparing for moments like this. She had the floor plan of the corridor outside her door, which she had walked enough times to know in her body rather than her memory. She had the medication delivery schedule for the room directly across the hall. The compound's attending medical staff delivered the household's elderly groundskeeper his 2 in the morning cardiac medication with a consistency she had noted on day 4 because consistency in medical schedules was something her nursing training had made her automatically track. That delivery was due in 90 seconds and would require the corridor light to be switched on from the panel at the corridor's midpoint. She had the maintenance access panel she had found on day 3 in the alcove 12 feet from her door, behind the decorative panel that didn't sit quite flush with the wall because it had been replaced at some point with a piece cut 2 millimeters too narrow. She had found it because she had run her hand along the wall while walking slowly during a recovery stretch, the way you run your hand along a wall when you have nothing specific to do and your hands need something. She had opened it out of the mild and aimless curiosity of someone spending too much time in a confined space, and she had seen the fire suppression manual override inside it, and she had closed it again and continued her walk and filed the information in the place where she kept things that had no immediate use but were too specific to forget. She had 2 years of clinical anatomy and the specific knowledge from her second semester of a cluster of nerves in the radial aspect of the wrist that, compressed at the correct angle with the correct brief force, caused involuntary release of whatever the hand was holding. She had practiced it on herself during study, the way nursing students practice assessment techniques, until she could find it in the dark. She stood in the doorway of her room as the 2 men came down the corridor, and she let them come, and she waited with the patience of someone who understood that the only advantage she had was the one they had given her by not considering her worth preparing for. The corridor light came on at 2:03, the night staff member crossing to deliver the cardiac medication, and in the half-second of adjustment that any set of eyes makes when light arrives unexpectedly in darkness, Racheal moved. She didn't move toward the closer man. She moved toward the farther one, the one on her left, because her clinical eye had spent 4 days cataloging the way Minjun's people carried themselves, and this man held his weapon in his right hand with the left held slightly away from the body in the specific way of someone who had a shoulder that didn't rotate fully, an old injury, partially compensated, creating a blind side he probably no longer thought about consciously because the body adapts and makes its limitations feel like normal. She found the wrist. She found the nerve cluster in the dark by structure rather than sight, compressed it at the correct angle, and the hand opened. The sound the weapon made hitting the corridor floor was enough to pull the first man's attention sideways for the 2 seconds she needed to drive her right elbow backward into the alcove panel, pop it open, and hit the manual override with the flat of her palm. The suppression system activated with the sound and force of something that had been waiting under pressure for precisely this kind of invitation. The corridor filled with cold and noise and the specific chaos of a system designed to override every other consideration in the building, and in the chaos Racheal put her back against the wall, pressed her right hand to her left shoulder where the wound had announced itself with the sharp clarity of an injury that had not finished healing and was not interested in being ignored, and held her position. She did not run. There was nowhere to run. She held her position and waited, which was what she did when she had done everything she could do and the rest was no longer in her hands. The door at the end of the corridor came open 40 seconds later. Taesung came through it moving in a way she had not seen him move before, not the dense, pressurized walk of a man for whom the air clears in advance, but something faster and less controlled than that. Something that her mind catalogued quietly and without comment as the movement of a man who had stopped calculating the appearance of the thing and was simply moving toward it as fast as his body would carry him. He stopped when he saw the corridor, the 2 men on the floor, the open maintenance panel, the suppression system still cycling through its process in the cold wet air, and Racheal against the wall, her right hand pressed to her left shoulder, her feet planted, her face arranged in the expression of someone who had been right about something that had cost considerably more than being right usually costs, and who was too tired and too much in pain to dress that fact in anything more comfortable than what it was. He looked at the corridor for a long moment. He looked at her. She looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the corridor had not already said more clearly than she could. He was still breathing harder than she had ever seen him breathe. He looked at her hand pressed to her shoulder, and something moved across his face that his control caught quickly but not quite quickly enough, not quickly enough for someone who had spent 8 days learning to read the fraction of a second before his control arrived. Then he looked at her for one more moment, and his jaw settled, and he said one word. Minjun. Not a question. Not a command yet. The word of a man who has just finished the last verification he needed and has now arrived, fully and without remaining doubt, at the only conclusion the evidence had ever been pointing toward. The word landed in the corridor between them and did not require anything added to it. Racheal held her shoulder and breathed and said nothing, because the word had not been directed at her. It had been directed at the shape of what he now understood, which was larger than this corridor and older than tonight, and had been waiting in the architecture of his own trust for longer than either of them wanted to calculate. She had been right. She had been right 6 days ago, and the cost of the delay between then and now was soaking through the fabric pressed under her right hand, and she was not going to say that out loud. And she did not need to, and she suspected, from the specific quality of the way he was looking at her now, which was different from every other way he had looked at her in 8 days, that he already knew it better than she needed to tell him. What comes after a thing like that is not resolution in the clean sense. It is not the satisfying closure of a door that latches firmly and stays shut. It is more like the morning after a storm. The storm is gone, verifiably gone, and the air is different without it, but there is still the work of walking through the space it left, and understanding what it changed and what it took and what, against reasonable expectation, it left standing. Min-June was gone. The compound absorbed that fact the way it absorbed most difficult facts, quietly, and with the particular discipline of a household that had been trained to continue functioning regardless of what was happening in the rooms above it. The staff moved through their routines. The courtyard garden held its careful arrangement of stone and green and water. Atlanta continued outside the compound's walls, conducting its ordinary life with no knowledge of and no interest in what had been resolved in a residential corridor at 2 in the morning. Taesung disappeared into his work for 3 days. Not the disappearance of a man avoiding something. The disappearance of a man doing the thing he had been postponing and was now doing with the complete and undivided attention of someone who understood that postponing it further was no longer an option he could justify to himself. He pulled every personnel decision made in the last 2 years. Every appointment, every reassignment, every audit report that had resulted in a position changing hands. He reviewed them without delegation, without asking anyone to pre-sort or summarize, because pre-sorting was itself a form of interpretation, and he did not want interpretation. He wanted the raw material, and he wanted to look at it himself, and he wanted to do the looking with the eyes of a man who had finally accepted that proximity and duration are not the same thing as loyalty, and that he had been using them interchangeably for long enough to have made himself vulnerable in ways he was only now mapping in their full extent. He did not ask Racheal for help with any of it. She had given him what she had to give, the willingness to look, and the specific information that made looking unavoidable, and the rest was work that belonged to him. She understood that without being told. She understood it because she had spent enough of her life giving people what they needed to proceed and then stepping back to let them proceed, and she recognized the shape of this as that. Her shoulder was redressed on the morning after the corridor. The compound's physician worked on it with the same careful precision as before and with a silence that was not uncomfortable, the silence of a professional doing their work and not editorializing about the circumstances that had produced the need for it. Racheal sat still and let herself be treated and looked at the courtyard garden through the window, and did not think about the night before any more than was necessary to process it, and file it in the place where she kept things that had been survived. Young-sun came to her room that morning before the physician had finished. She did not come in, she stood in the doorway, and she looked at Racheal in the robe with her shoulder being redressed, and something moved across her face that was not performed and was not managed and was not dressed in any of the composed dignity she wore so consistently that it had started to seem like her natural skin. It was simpler than all of that. It was the look of a woman who had come very close, twice now, to losing something she had not fully understood she was in the process of finding, and who was not yet ready to put that look away and replace it with something more comfortable. Racheal looked back at her and said, "The tea was good this morning. The kitchen staff must have steeped it longer." Young-sun looked at her for one more moment. Then she made a sound that was almost a laugh, brief and real and slightly undone at the edges, and said she would tell them to do it that way from now on. She came back in the afternoon with the tea and they sat in the garden. They sat in the garden the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and the afternoon after that. Not because they had arranged it or decided it would be a habit, but because it became one in the way that things become habits when they are providing something both people need and neither person has to explain. They talked about ordinary things and sometimes about things that were not ordinary at all, and the line between those two categories blurred in the easy way it blurs between people who have stopped performing anything for each other's benefit. Young-sun told her about the first garden she had ever planted, in a rental apartment in a city she had not yet learned to call home. In containers on a concrete balcony because she had needed something living to tend and there was no other available ground. She described it with the unsentimental precision of a woman reporting a fact rather than a memory, and Racheal understood that the unsentimental precision was itself the tenderness. That young son's way of honoring the things that had mattered was to describe them exactly as they were, without the softening that implies the original was insufficient. Racheal told her about the nursing program. Not the debt that had ended it. She had told that part, or enough of it, in earlier conversations. She told her about the part before the debt. The specific semester when she had understood, with the clarity that arrives sometimes in the middle of an ordinary clinical morning, that this was the work she was supposed to be doing. That the combination of attention and precision and genuine investment in the body's capacity to repair itself was not a skill she had acquired but a nature she had discovered. She told it quietly and without the bitterness she had expected to feel, revisiting it, and found that the bitterness had moved somewhere it was not currently blocking the memory from being simply true. Tae-sung came to the garden on the fifth evening. He came without announcement, which was his way, and without the quality of a man who had prepared for this, which was not his way, and which Racheal noticed. He sat in the chair across from hers. The one young son had vacated an hour earlier when the evening cool had started to settle into the stone paths, and he sat in it without arranging himself into a particular posture and without the preliminary of any social construction. The garden held its evening quiet around them. The water feature caught the last of the light in the way it always did at this hour, which Racheal had observed enough times now that it felt familiar in the particular way that only things you have returned to repeatedly can feel. He was quiet for long enough that she didn't expect him to speak first. She had been learning, in the past 8 days, the specific textures of his silence. There were several, and they were not interchangeable, and this one was the texture of a man arriving at something he had been approaching from a distance, and was now standing directly in front of. He said, "You could have gone back. At any point after the first day, I would have let you go." He said it not as an accusation and not as a compliment, and not as the opening of a negotiation. He said it as the plain statement of a man who had been sitting with a question for several days and had decided the only way to resolve it was to say it aloud to the person who was the only possible answer to it. Racheal looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from the beginning, directly, without the managed distance she used in rooms where she needed to be careful, without the social padding she had learned to wrap honesty in when the recipient needed it softened. She had stopped doing that in this house. She was not sure exactly when, but she had. She said, "I know. That's why I stayed." Not because she had nowhere else to go. Not because she was afraid of what leaving would mean. Not because she had calculated that staying was the safer or more advantageous position. She had stayed because somewhere between the persimmon tea and the repositioned bench and the lamplit room and the corridor at 2 in the morning, this had become a place she was choosing rather than a place she had been placed, and choosing it had felt like something she had not felt in a very long time. Like an act belonging to a person who believed her own presence somewhere was worth the decision to remain. He looked at her for a moment after she said it. Then he nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man receiving something he had needed to hear confirmed and is now letting it settle into the place he has been keeping clear for it. They stayed in the garden until the light was fully gone. 3 weeks later, a document arrived. Not delivered by anyone who made a moment of the delivery, left on the small table beside the courtyard window, the way the newspaper had been left outside her door in a different house, in what felt now like a different chapter of something she was still in the middle of writing. It was an enrollment confirmation. The nursing program she had left 4 years ago, at a school in Atlanta, for a cohort beginning the following semester. Tuition marked as covered, in full, with a note attached in handwriting she had not seen before but recognized immediately as belonging to someone who had been taught to write with the care of someone who understood that how you put words on a page reflects how seriously you take the words. The note said only, "This was always yours." It should have stayed that way. No's signature. None was needed. Racheal sat with the document for a long time. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with things that were large enough to require time before they could be properly received, not rushing toward the feeling, not deflecting from it, just letting it arrive at its own pace and settle into its own shape. The world had not become safe. She understood that clearly and without illusion. The wound in her shoulder was still completing its repair. The years before this one, the mother who left, the debt, the particular exhaustion of being capable in rooms that didn't invest in capable people. Those years were still hers and would always be hers and were not erased by anything that had happened in the last several weeks. You don't lose the years. You carry them, and what changes is not their weight but what you carry them toward, she accepted. Not with the gratitude of someone receiving a gift they didn't believe they deserved. With the quiet, grounded acknowledgement of someone receiving what had always been true, that she was a person in whom someone had finally decided to invest, and that this decision was not charity, was not transaction, was not ownership dressed in generosity. It was recognition. The specific, costly, and far too rare recognition of what it had taken to be who she was, in the circumstances she had been given, for as long as she had been given them. This is what Racheal Williams's story is actually about. Not the bullet, though the bullet is where it begins. Not the powerful family, or the dangerous house, or the man who learned, slowly and at considerable cost, to let something past the walls he had been building since he was old enough to understand they were necessary. It is about what happens when a woman who has spent years making herself smaller in rooms that didn't see her finally stops. Not loudly. Not with a declaration or a confrontation or a moment that announces itself as the turning point. Just stops. Stops measuring the distance to the exit. Stops editing herself down to the size the room seems to prefer. Stops treating her own presence as something that requires justification before it can be offered. Racheal Williams took a bullet for a woman she didn't know. She did not do it because she was brave in the way that word usually gets used, the word that implies the absence of fear and the presence of some exceptional quality that most people don't possess. She did it because she had learned, from a mother who left, from a debt that swallowed a dream, from years of being the most capable person in rooms that would not remember her name, that the cost of shrinking yourself to fit a world that has decided not to see you is not zero. It accumulates. It compounds. It costs, in the end, more than any other risk you could have taken. She survived by being exactly who she was. Every part of it, the nursing school knowledge, the hospitality-trained reading of rooms and bodies and the spaces between what people say and what they mean, the habit of noticing what others file as background, the willingness to stand in a corridor with a healing wound and no weapon and hold her position anyway. She didn't win anything by becoming someone else. She won everything by refusing, finally and completely, to become less than herself. The nursing program starts in 6 weeks. The garden is still there, and the persimmon tea is steeped longer now, and the bench is still 18 inches from where the designer put it, and exactly where it needs to be, and Racheal Williams is still walking toward the room she is meant to be standing in. She always was. She just needed somewhere, finally, that could see it.